The alarm on the bridge of the Endurance was not supposed to sound like that. Captain looked up from his morning coffee, his dark eyes narrowing at the flashing red light. The sound was sharp and urgent, the kind that meant something had gone very wrong somewhere in the galaxy. "Report," he said, setting down his cup. Lieutenant Minu worked the controls quickly, his fingers dancing across the holographic display. "Sir, we're picking up a Galactic Council emergency broadcast. Priority Alpha, it's about the system." Felt his stomach tighten. There were good people. He had met a few of them at the last diplomatic conference. They were artists and poets, gentle souls who loved music more than war. Put it on screen. The main flickered to life. A crystalline being appeared, its body made of living light and geometric patterns. It was one of the oldest species in the council. When it spoke, its voice was cold and mechanical, translated through advanced technology. "This is Council Alert 4471. That has been infected with a Class 5 genetic plague. Mortality rate 100%. Transmission rate to carbon-based life 97%. The plague is called Crimson Decay. There is no cure. There will be no rescue. Effective immediately, a quarantine barrier is being placed around the system. No ship may enter. No resources will be sent. This decision is final." The screen went dark. The bridge was silent, could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "How many are left?" Minu checked the data, his face pale. 4.3 million, sir, out of an original population of 6 million. "And the council is just leaving them to die?" "It appears so, sir." Stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Get me a direct line to Doctor now." Down in the medical bay, Doctor was already watching the broadcast on her own screen. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and even sharper intelligence. She had studied alien biology for 20 years, and she had never seen anything like this. The Crimson Decay was a monster. According to the data the Council had released, it attacked the genetic code itself, unraveling DNA like someone pulling threads from a sweater. Victims lost control of their bodies first, then their memories, then their minds. Death came slowly over weeks of suffering. And the Council had decided to do nothing. Her communicator buzzed, "Here. Doctor, I need you to analyze everything we have on this plague." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I want to know if the Council is right. Can it really not be cured?" Pulled up the medical files, scanning through page after page of data. "The Council's research is thorough, Captain. The plague is unlike anything we've encountered. It's almost as if," she paused, frowning, "as if it was designed to be incurable." "Designed? You mean someone made this?" "I can't be sure yet, but the genetic structure is too perfect, too efficient. Nature doesn't usually work this cleanly." She took a deep breath. "But to answer your question, yes, based on this data, the Council is probably right. There's no known cure." "Probably isn't definitely," said quietly. Smiled despite the grim situation. "No, sir, it isn't." 3 days later, Ambassador stood in the great chamber of the Galactic Council. The room was enormous, built to hold representatives from 100 different species. Some breathed oxygen, others methane, still others existed as pure energy. The Council represented thousands of years of cooperation and peace among the stars. Right now, hated every single one of them. "Honorable Council members," he began, his voice steady despite his fury. "I am here to formally request that the quarantine around the system be lifted. Humanity wishes to send medical teams and researchers to help find a cure." The chamber erupted in noise. Clicks, whistles, translated objections in a dozen languages. The representative's voice cut through the chaos. "Ambassador, the risk is absolute. The math is clear. If even one ship becomes infected and leaves the quarantine zone, the plague could spread across the galaxy. Trillions would die." "Then we won't leave the zone until we have a cure," shot back. A prior, one of the ancient ones who had lived for thousands of years, spoke next. Its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "You humans are young. You do not understand. We have seen plagues before. Sometimes mercy means letting the sick die so the healthy may live. This is the logical choice." Logic's voice rose. 4 million people are dying down there. They're scared. They're in pain. And you're telling me the logical choice is to abandon them? "Yes," the prior said simply. Looked around the chamber at all the different species, all the civilizations that had reached for the stars. "Then humanity chooses differently. We choose compassion over logic. We choose to try, even if the odds are impossible." The collective spoke, its 1,000 voices perfectly synchronized. "If you enter that quarantine zone, humanity will face sanctions, trade embargoes, possible expulsion from this council. Your species will be isolated." "Better isolated and moral than accepted in cowards," said. He left the chamber to shocked silence. Back on Earth, in a military complex buried deep beneath the mountains, Commander read the reports from the council session. He was a career officer, a man who had spent his entire adult life in service. He knew about impossible missions. He had survived 3 of them. This would be his 4th. He activated his communicator. "This is Commander. I'm officially requesting volunteers for Operation Lighthouse. Mission parameters: enter the quarantine zone, study the Crimson Decay, find a cure or treatment. Risk level extreme. Survival rate unknown." He expected maybe a few dozen volunteers. Elite soldiers, crazy scientists, people with nothing to lose. Within 6 hours, he had over 10,000 applications. Dr. Sara was among the first to volunteer. She was a microbiologist, brilliant and driven, with a personal reason for joining. Her sister had died from a disease that no one could cure. She remembered watching her sister fade away, remembered feeling helpless and useless. Never again, she had promised herself. Engineer Wu volunteered because someone had to keep the ships running. Combat medic volunteered because that's what medics did. They ran toward danger, not away from it. Bora volunteered because she had dedicated her life to understanding alien life, and she wasn't about to let an entire species go extinct. One by one they came. They knew the risks. They understood the odds. They went anyway. As the human fleet prepared to launch, Captain stood on the bridge of the Endurance and watched Earth slowly shrink behind them. Somewhere out there, 4 million were dying. Somewhere out there, the galaxy had decided they weren't worth saving. But humanity had never been good at accepting no as an answer. "Set course for the system," ordered. "Maximum speed." The stars stretched into lines of light as the Endurance jumped to faster-than-light speed. Behind them, a dozen more ships followed. The galaxy had the. Humanity refused to abandon them. The journey would take 3 weeks. 3 weeks while millions died. 3 weeks to prepare for the impossible. 3 weeks until they discovered whether human stubbornness was enough to defeat a plague that had already killed 2 million souls. The quarantine barrier looked like a wall of shimmering light stretched across empty space. It was beautiful and deadly, a cage made of energy fields and automated defense satellites. Any ship that tried to cross would be destroyed instantly. Unless they had clearance from the Galactic Council, which humanity did not have. Commander stood in the war room aboard the carrier ship Defiance, studying tactical displays with his senior officers. The fleet had grown during their journey. What started as 12 ships was now 27. More kept arriving, bringing volunteers and supplies from every human colony in known space. "The barrier has weak points," Lieutenant said, pointing to spots on the holographic map. "The satellites don't cover everything. We can slip through here, here, and here." "And once we're through," asked. "Then we're committed. The barrier works both ways. We won't be able to leave until the Council lowers it or we find a way to break through." Looked uncomfortable. "Sir, If things go wrong in there, we'll be trapped with a deadly plague and no way home, finished. I know, everyone knows. They volunteered anyway. On the Endurance, Doctor was briefing her medical teams. The research bay had been converted into a high-security laboratory with multiple layers of containment and decontamination. Suits hung on the walls like empty ghosts waiting to be filled. The crimson decay attacks genetic structure, she explained, showing microscopic images on the screen. It's like nothing we've seen before. It doesn't just kill cells, it corrupts them, turns them against the host body. A young nurse named raised her hand. Is there any chance we're immune because we're human? Hesitated. Honestly, we don't know. Human genetic structure is different enough that we might have some natural resistance. But might isn't something I want to bet lives on. Everyone follows quarantine protocols. No exceptions. Across the fleet, similar briefings were happening. Engineer Wu gathered his team to discuss how to maintain ship systems in a quarantine environment. They couldn't risk contamination spreading through air vents or water recycling. Every system would need to be isolated, every repair made in full protective gear. This is going to be miserable, one of the younger engineers muttered. Wu nodded. Yes, it will be, but 4 million people are dying down there. I think we can handle being uncomfortable. The Galactic Council's surveillance network picked up the human fleet the moment they approached the barrier. Alerts went out immediately. Emergency sessions were called. The crystalline representative watched the approaching ships on the display and felt something it hadn't felt in centuries: uncertainty. They're really going to do it, another council member whispered. They're fools, the prior said. They will all die, and for what? A species they barely know. But even as it spoke, the prior felt doubt creeping in. It had lived for 3,000 years, had seen civilizations rise and fall, had made countless calculations about risk and reward. The math always worked. Logic always won. So why did watching these humans fly towards certain doom feel wrong? On Prime, the dying planet below the barrier, Administrator received news of the approaching human fleet. He was in the final stages of the crimson decay himself. His hands shook constantly now, and sometimes he forgot where he was. But his mind was still clear enough to understand what he was seeing. They're coming, he asked his aide, his voice weak. The humans are really coming. Yes, Administrator. Scans show 27 ships approaching the barrier. In felt tears running down his face. They had been alone for so long, watching their world die, watching their people suffer. The Council had abandoned them. The galaxy had written them off as already dead. But humanity hadn't. Send them a message, In said. Tell them we don't understand. Ask them why they're doing this. The message was transmitted as the human fleet reached the barrier. Captain received it on the bridge of the Endurance. He read it twice, feeling the weight of the question. Why? He opened a channel, broadcasting on all frequencies, making sure every ship in the fleet could hear, making sure the could hear, making sure even the Council's surveillance drones could record his answer. Administrator this is Captain of the human vessel Endurance. You ask why we're doing this. The answer is simple. Because someone has to. Because it's the right thing to do. Because we've been the ones left behind before and we remember what that feels like. Because 4 million lives matter, even if the galaxy says they don't. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But most of all, we're doing this because we're human, and humans don't abandon people. Not when there's even the smallest chance we can help. That's just who we are. The message ended. Silence filled the channel. Then slowly a response came back from Prime. It was audio only but could hear the emotion in his translated voice. Thank you, we will help you however we can. Commander gave the order. All ships prepare to cross the barrier. Navigation take us through. The fleet moved forward as one. The barrier sensors detected them immediately. Alarms blared. The automated defense satellites locked weapons on the approaching ships. But the satellites had been programmed with one crucial weakness. They could shoot down ships entering the barrier, but not ships leaving. The Council had designed it that way deliberately. If any survivors managed to escape the plague, the barrier wouldn't stop them. So when the human ships approached from the outside but transmitted authorization codes claiming they were already inside trying to leave, the satellites paused. Just for 3 seconds. Just long enough for the confusion to break their targeting locks. 3 seconds was all the human fleet needed. They crossed the barrier in a rush of speed and light. Warning klaxons faded behind them as they entered the quarantine zone. There was no going back now. "We're through," the navigator reported. Looked at where Prime hung in space like a dying jewel. Even from orbit, he could see the signs of collapse. Cities that should have blazed with light were dark. Atmospheric readings showed pollution from uncontrolled industrial fires. The planet was dying. But it wasn't dead yet. "All ships, this is Commander. We are now officially in quarantine. From this moment forward, we are cut off from the rest of humanity until this mission is complete. I won't lie to you, the odds are against us. The Council thinks we're going to fail. They think we're all going to die down there." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm with conviction. "Let's prove them wrong. Medical teams prepare for planetfall. Research Division begins setting up the lab station on Moon. Engineering, I want full quarantine protocols active within the hour. We came here to save lives, so let's get to work." Across the fleet, people moved into action. Dr. Sora organized her research team, preparing to collect samples. Engineer Wu began the complex process of establishing isolated systems. Medic checked and rechecked her supplies, knowing that once they went down to the planet's surface, there would be no resupply, no backup, no rescue. They were alone now, alone with a dying species and a plague that had never been cured. But they were human. And humans didn't give up. As the first shuttles launched toward Prime, carrying medical teams and supplies, the galaxy watched. Some species watched in scorn, certain that humanity's foolishness would lead to disaster. Others watched in fascination, wondering if these young, emotional beings might actually succeed. And a few, just a few, watched in hope. Because maybe, just maybe, logic wasn't the only path to survival. Maybe sometimes, compassion was enough. The city was dying. Medic stepped off the shuttle onto the surface of Prime and felt her breath catch in her throat. She had read the reports, seen the images, studied the casualty numbers, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of what the Crimson Decay had done to this world. The capital city had once held 2 million people. Now the streets were nearly empty. Bodies lay where they had fallen, covered with sheets by those too weak to carry them away. Buildings stood silent, their windows dark. Somewhere in the distance could hear crying. "Stay focused," she told her team, her voice steady despite the horror around them. "We're here to help the living. Let's move." They had set up a medical station in what used to be a concert hall. They had built it centuries ago, a beautiful space with perfect acoustics for their beloved music. Now it was filled with beds, medical equipment, and the dying. Moved from bed to bed, checking vitals, adjusting medications, offering what comfort she could. The Crimson Decay was worse up close. She watched a young trying to eat, his hands shaking so badly that food kept falling from his grasp. An elderly female who could no longer remember her own name. A child who had lost the ability to speak. "Can you help them?" asked a doctor named N. He was infected too, could see the telltale red marks spreading across his skin, but he still worked, still tried to save others. "We're going to try," said. It was all she could promise. Above the planet, on Moon, Dr. Sora was building humanity's last hope. The research station was a collection of modules connected by sealed corridors, every surface sterilized, every air filter checked 3 times. This was where they would study the plague. This was where they would find the cure. If a cure existed. Sora sat in the main laboratory, staring at samples of the crimson decay under the microscope. The pathogen was beautiful in a terrible way, its structure perfect and elegant. It moved through cells like a key designed specifically for a lock, corrupting DNA with surgical precision. "It's too perfect," she muttered to herself. Doctor working at the next station looked up. "What do you mean?" "Natural evolution is messy," Sora explained, pulling up genetic maps on the holographic display. "Viruses and bacteria mutate randomly. They're full of redundant code, useless sequences, evolutionary dead ends. But this," she highlighted sections of the pathogen's genome. "This is clean, efficient. Every piece serves a purpose." Came over to look, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data. "You're saying it was designed." "I'm saying it's possible." Sora pulled up more analysis. "Look at this. The plague targets a very specific genetic marker, not all carbon-based life, just species with this particular DNA sequence." "How many species have that marker?" Sora ran the search through the galactic database. The answer made her blood run cold. 18 species, including the. "And the others?" 3 are already extinct, 7 are classified as endangered, the rest. Sora's voice trailed off as she recognized names on the list. The priors, the major council species. The implications hung in the air between them. If the crimson decay was a weapon, and if it targeted specific species, then someone was trying to commit genocide on a galactic scale. "We need to tell someone," said quietly. "Who? The council. They're the ones who left the to die. What if some of them are behind this?" They sat in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. Down on the planet, Engineer Wu was facing a different kind of problem. The infrastructure was collapsing. Power plants ran by dead workers were failing. Water purification systems had stopped working weeks ago. The survivors were living in conditions that got worse every day. "We need to stabilize their basic systems," he told his team. "Power first, then water, then waste management." "Sir, we don't have enough people," one of his engineers protested. "This whole planet is falling apart." "Then we prioritize. We save what we can." Wu pulled up city maps, marking the areas with the highest survivor populations. "We focus here, here, and here. The rest will have to wait." It was brutal triage on a planetary scale. At night, when the work finally stopped, the humans would gather and share what they had seen. Talked about a mother who had died holding her child's hand. Wu described finding a power plant where the workers had stayed at their posts until the very end, keeping the lights on for their city even as the plague killed them one by one. Dr. Bora told them about culture. "They're artists," she said softly. "Every single one of them. Musicians, painters, poets. I found a museum today. Even now, with everything falling apart, someone had covered the artwork with protective sheets, trying to preserve it for whoever might come after." The stories hurt, but they also reminded the humans why they were there. In the research station, Dr. Sora wasn't sleeping. She had been running tests for 72 hours straight, surviving on stimulants and determination. The crimson decay was a puzzle, and she was certain the answer was hidden in its structure. "Computer, compare the plague's genetic sequence to known bioweapons in the galactic database." "Working," the computer replied in its neutral voice. "Search complete. 57% match with the plague designed 300 years ago. 43% match with the fever designed 800 years ago. Both bioweapons were banned under galactic law." Sora leaned forward. "Show me who designed those weapons." The plague was developed by a faction within the collective, later purged and dissolved. The fever was created by unknown parties, never identified. The collective, one of the most powerful species on the council, the same council that had refused to help the. Sora's hands were shaking as she compiled her report. This was bigger than just saving the. This was about exposing a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of galactic power. But first, they still needed to find a cure. Doctor had been studying human immune responses to the plague. They had been lucky so far, no human infections. The genetic difference between human and biology seemed to provide natural protection. But that same difference meant that human antibodies probably wouldn't work on patients. Unless, said, explaining her theory to the research team, we expose humans to controlled amounts of the plague. Let their immune systems develop antibodies. Then we synthesize those antibodies and modify them to work with biology. That's insane, someone said. It's a long shot, admitted, but it's the best idea we have. It would require human volunteers to deliberately get infected, Sora pointed out. I know. The survival rate would be maybe 50%, maybe. I know that too. They looked at each other across the laboratory, two scientists who had traveled across the galaxy to save strangers, who had crossed a quarantine barrier knowing they might never leave, who had watched an entire species dying and refused to accept it. We need to ask for volunteers, Sora said finally. The message went out to all human personnel in the system. They explained the theory. They explained the risks. They were honest about the odds. Within 6 hours, they had more than 100 volunteers. Combat Medic was first in line. You don't have to do this, Sora told her. You're needed down on the planet. Smiled grimly. I'm needed wherever I can do the most good. Right now, that's on your testing table. She paused. My grandmother died from a disease that didn't have a cure. I watched her waste away, watched the doctors give up. I promised myself I'd never give up on someone who needed help. This is me keeping that promise. Over the next week, 16 humans underwent controlled infection with the Crimson Decay. They were isolated in special medical pods, monitored constantly, their immune systems studied in real time as they fought the pathogen. 12 of them survived. 4 didn't. Sora recorded their names herself. They would not be forgotten. They had died saving a species they had never met, proving that some things mattered more than survival. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The antibodies their bodies produced were exactly what Sora needed. She worked day and night, synthesizing and modifying them, creating a treatment serum that biology could accept. When the first batch was ready, Captain himself took it down to the planet. He walked into the medical center where had been working, carrying a case of vials that might hold the cure. Administrator In was there, barely conscious, his body ravaged by the plague, knelt beside his bed. We have something, said quietly. It might not work, but we'd like to try. In's eyes focused on him with difficulty. You've done so much already. Why? Because you matter, said simply. Every single one of you matters. They administered the first dose. And they waited. The first sign that the serum was working came 36 hours after Administrator In received his injection. His hand stopped shaking. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been watching him for weeks. But Medic had been watching. She saw him reach for a glass of water without spilling it, saw him grip a stylus and write his name without trembling. Administrator, she said carefully, not daring to hope, how do you feel? In looked at his hands with wonder. Better, I feel, better. The medical bay erupted in controlled chaos. Doctors rushed to run tests to confirm what they were seeing. The crimson decay markers in his blood were decreasing, slowly but measurably. His corrupted cells were beginning to repair themselves. The serum was working. Immediately contacted Dr. Sora on the research station. It's working, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Sora, the treatment is actually working. On the moon base, Sora closed her eyes and let herself feel relief for exactly 5 seconds. Then she opened them again and got back to work. How much improvement? 20% reduction in pathogen levels. His motor control is returning. Cognitive function is improving. Side effects: minor fever, some nausea, nothing serious. Sara pulled up her calculations. They had produced enough serum to treat maybe 1,000 patients. There were over 4 million still alive on the planet below. We need more, she said quietly, a lot more. The problem was simple and terrible. The serum required human antibodies, and humans only produced those antibodies by being exposed to the crimson decay. They had already lost 4 volunteers. How many more would die to save the... Captain called an emergency meeting of all senior staff. They gathered in the briefing room aboard the Endurance, their faces showing the strain of weeks in the quarantine zone. "We have a treatment that works," began without preamble. "But we don't have enough of it. Dr. Sora estimates we need antibodies from at least 5,000 donors to produce enough serum for all the survivors." The room was quiet. "We've already asked people to risk infection once," said Commander. 16 people volunteered, 4 of them died. Are we really going to ask for thousands more? The survival rate was 75% in the first round, Doctor pointed out. Now that we understand the infection process better, we can improve those odds, maybe to 80 or 85%. Which means if 5,000 people volunteer, we're still looking at 700 to 1,000 deaths, said flatly. Against 4 million lives saved, Sora replied. I know it sounds cold, but that's the math. Rubbed his face tiredly. This isn't a decision I can make alone. This has to go to all personnel. He looked around the room. We need to be honest with them, tell them exactly what we're asking, and then let them choose. The message went out that evening to every human in the system. It was broadcast to the research station, to the ships in orbit, to the medical teams on the planet's surface. Captain's face appeared on every screen. By now, you've all heard that we have a working treatment for the crimson decay, he said. This is real. We can save but producing enough serum requires human volunteers to undergo controlled infection. We need 5,000 donors. He paused, letting that number sink in. I'm not going to lie to you. The infection process is dangerous. We've improved our protocols, but the survival rate is still only about 85%. If 5,000 of you volunteer, statistically, 750 of you won't make it. On screens across the fleet, humans watched their captain struggle with what came next. I can't order you to do this. I won't order you to do this. This has to be your choice, but I will tell you what's at stake. 4 million are still alive. They're artists, teachers, parents, children. They're people who matter. And they're dying because of a plague that someone deliberately created to kill them. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. We came here because we refused to abandon them. We've already sacrificed so much. And now I'm asking if you're willing to sacrifice more, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. The broadcast ended. And then humanity answered. Within 12 hours, over 8,000 people had volunteered. They came from every ship, every department, every background. Engineers and soldiers, doctors and technicians, veterans and rookies. Some were young, barely out of training. Others had gray in their hair and decades of service. Engineer Wu volunteered, saying simply, I've fixed enough machines. Time to help fix people. Dr. Bora volunteered, explaining that she had studied them for years and would be damned if she let them die now. Even Lieutenant, who had expressed doubts about the mission from the beginning, stepped forward. I thought you were all crazy, he told Commander. I still think you're crazy, but you're my kind of crazy. The logistics were staggering. Dr. Sora organized the volunteers into groups of 100, each group undergoing infection in specially prepared medical bays. They were monitored constantly, their symptoms tracked, their antibody production measured. The first few days were the hardest. Volunteers developed fevers, body aches, nausea. Some got worse, their immune systems struggling against the plague. Medical teams worked around the clock, ready to intervene if someone's condition became critical. Moved between the medical bays, checking on patients, offering encouragement. She had survived her own infection and wore her recovery like armor, showing the newer volunteers that survival was possible. "How are you feeling?" she asked a young engineer named who was sweating through his third day of fever. "Like I'm being cooked from the inside out," he muttered, "but I'll live, right?" "Your vitals are strong, you're fighting it well." She checked his IV fluids. "The worst should be over in another day or two. And then my antibodies can save someone." "Lots of someones." Managed a weak smile. "Good, that's good." Not all the stories ended well. Despite improved protocols, people still died. Sora kept a list of names, adding to it with a heavy heart each time another volunteer didn't make it. They were heroes, every single one, but that didn't make the losses any easier. On the planet below, they watched in disbelief as humans literally died to save them. Administrator In, now recovering thanks to the serum, tried to understand what would motivate an entire species to such sacrifice. "Why do they keep coming?" he asked one day. "So many of them are dying, why don't they stop?" Thought about all the volunteers she had seen, all the people who had stepped forward despite the risks. "Because we're human," she said finally, "and humans don't quit." As the weeks passed, the antibody production increased. Dr. Sora's team worked in shifts, synthesizing serum around the clock. The first 1,000 doses, then 5,000, then 10,000. Captain coordinated distribution to the planet's surface. Medical teams spread out across the surviving population centers, administering the treatment to the sickest patients first. The results were consistent. Not everyone could be saved, but the majority responded to the serum. The Crimson Decay was being beaten. But the cost kept mounting. By the time they had enough serum for all 4 million survivors, the human death toll had reached 912. 912 people who had volunteered knowing they might die. 912 names that Sora recorded in her memorial file. 912 heroes that the galaxy would never know. Commander stood at the observation window of the Defiance, looking down at Prime. From orbit, he could already see changes. Lights were coming back on in the cities. Power plants were running again. The planet was healing. "We did it," Lieutenant said quietly beside him. "Yeah," replied, "we did." Was it worth it, losing almost 1,000 people? Thought about the question for a long time. Ask me that again when we see how many survive, when we see them rebuild their world, when their children grow up and make art and music and all the things that make life worth living. He turned to face. Then I'll tell you if it was worth it. In the research station, Dr. Sora was compiling her final report. The medical data, the treatment protocols, the evidence that the Crimson Decay had been deliberately engineered. All of it would be transmitted to Earth and, eventually, to the Galactic Council. Someone had tried to commit genocide. Someone had created a plague designed to wipe out specific species, and humanity had evidence to prove it. "This is going to cause a lot of problems," Doctor said, reading over Sora's shoulder. "Good," Sora replied. "It should cause problems. This is attempted mass murder on a scale the galaxy hasn't seen in centuries. The Council won't be happy. The Council abandoned 4 million people to die. I don't much care if they're happy." Down on Prime, in the concert hall that had become a hospital, the last patient was being treated. A young child, barely old enough to speak, received her injection from medics' steady hands. "There you go," said softly. "You're going to be okay now." The child's mother, herself recovering from the plague, cried as she held her daughter close. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Outside, the sun was rising over a world that had been given a second chance. 6 months after the human fleet crossed the quarantine barrier, the last patient was declared free of the Crimson Decay. The numbers were devastating and triumphant at the same time. Of the 6 million who had lived on there before the plague, only 2.6 million survived. An entire civilization had been cut nearly in half. But that 2.6 million were alive because humanity had refused to let them die. Captain stood in the central plaza of the capital, watching as workers unveiled the monument. It was made of crystal and metal, reaching toward the sky like hands held in prayer. Carved into its base were names. 912 human names. And below them, the names of medical workers who had died fighting the plague alongside their human rescuers. Above all the names in both human script and symbols was a single phrase. They were, "We refuse to abandon. This is the measure of sentience." Administrator and stood beside, healthy now, his body fully recovered from the plague that had nearly killed him. "We will never forget this," he said quietly. "Never." "Just promise me you'll rebuild," replied. "Make art, make music, live the lives they saved." "We will, I promise you we will." Above the planet, the Galactic Council's surveillance drones had been watching the entire time. They had recorded everything: the treatment, the volunteers, the deaths, the recoveries, and they had transmitted it all back to Council headquarters. Now, 6 months later, the Council finally lowered the quarantine barrier. The human fleet could leave, they could go home. But first, there was unfinished business. Ambassador stood once again in the great chamber of the Galactic Council, but this time he wasn't alone. Dr. Sora stood beside him, carrying a data device that contained all their research, all their evidence. "Honorable Council members," began, his voice calm and controlled. "6 months ago you left the to die. You called it logic, you called it mercy. You said the math was clear." The chamber was silent. Every species in the council was watching. They had all seen the reports from the quarantine zone. They knew what humanity had accomplished. "We disagreed with your math," continued. "And so we went into the quarantine zone. We studied the Crimson Decay. We developed a treatment. And we saved 2.6 million lives." The representative's crystalline form pulsed with light. "At the cost of 912 human lives. Was that acceptable to you?" "It was their choice," said simply. "Every single one volunteered. They knew the risks and they went anyway, because that's what people with compassion do." "Compassion is not logical," the prior said, its ancient voice echoing through the chamber. "No," agreed. "It's not, but it's necessary, because during our research we discovered something your logical analysis missed." He nodded to Dr. Sora. Sora activated the data device, projecting information onto the chamber's main display. The Crimson Decay was not a natural plague. It was engineered, designed specifically to target species with a particular genetic marker. Murmurs rippled through the council. 18 species have this marker, Sora continued, highlighting the list. 3 are already extinct. There were meant to be the 4th. And then the plague would have moved on to the next target, and the next, until all 18 species were gone. "That's impossible," one of the council members said. "Is it?" Sora pulled up more data. "The plague shares genetic sequences with known bioweapons, weapons that were developed by a faction within the collective 300 years ago, a faction that believed certain species were competitors that needed to be eliminated." The chamber erupted in noise. Accusations flew. The collective representatives defended themselves loudly, but the evidence was clear and damning. "Someone tried to commit genocide," said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "And your response was to abandon the victims, to let them die. If humanity hadn't intervened, an entire species would be extinct right now, and you would never have known it was murder." The prior floated forward, its ancient form seeming to shrink slightly. "You are correct, Ambassador. We failed. We performed our calculations and made our logical choices, and we were wrong." It was perhaps the first time in thousands of years that the prior had admitted to being wrong. What humanity did in that quarantine zone, the prior continued, was not logical. It was not safe. By all our measurements, it should have ended in disaster. But it didn't, because you understood something we forgot. Mathematics alone cannot measure the value of life. The representative approached the human delegation. Its crystalline body chimed softly, a sound of respect. We called you irrational. We called you fools. We were certain you would fail. And yet you succeeded where our logic said success was impossible. It paused, and when it spoke again, its translated voice carried something that might have been shame. We are sorry for for doubting humanity, for forgetting that wisdom is not the same as intelligence, and that compassion has its own kind of logic. The Council voted unanimously to lift all sanctions against humanity. The trade embargoes were ended. The threats of expulsion were withdrawn. More than that, the investigation into the Crimson Decay's origins was opened officially, with human representatives given prominent roles. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy saw humanity. They were no longer just the young species, the newcomers who didn't understand how things worked. They were the species that had crossed a quarantine barrier, that had sacrificed nearly 1,000 of their own to save strangers, that had refused to accept the impossible. They were the species that didn't abandon people. 10 years later, the changes were obvious everywhere. They had rebuilt their civilization. Their population was growing again, and their art had taken on new depth, new meaning. Every piece of music, every painting, every poem carried echoes of the plague and of the humans who had saved them. The Human Cultural Exchange Program was one of the most successful initiatives in the galaxy. Thousands of humans lived and worked on Prime, while artists brought their unique perspectives to human worlds. Dr. Now directed the Medical Alliance, working with researchers from dozens of species to develop treatments for diseases that had once been considered incurable. The protocols developed during the Crimson Decay crisis had revolutionized emergency medicine across the galaxy. Engineer Wu had married an architect named Ra. Their collaborative designs combined human engineering with aesthetics, creating stations and habitats that were both functional and beautiful. Their work was in demand from one end of the galaxy to the other. Medic ran a training program teaching emergency response to medical personnel from every species. She had become something of a legend, the human who had volunteered for infection and then treated patients while recovering herself. Dr. Sora continued her research, now hunting for other potential bioweapons hidden in the galaxy's genetic databases. The investigation into the Crimson Decay had uncovered a network of extinct species, all with similar genetic markers, all dying from plagues that had seemed natural at the time. She was determined to make sure it never happened again. Captain commanded a new ship, the Unity, which led cooperative missions between human and allied species. The old divisions between races were breaking down, slowly but surely, as more species learned from humanity's example. In Commander, he retired from active service and became an instructor, teaching the next generation of officers about the mission to Prime, about the volunteers, about the cost and the triumph. We lost 912 people, he would tell his students. Every single one of them knew the risks. Every single one chose to go anyway. Why? And his students would answer, because it was right, because people needed help, because humans don't abandon people. Exactly, would say. Remember that. When you're out there, when you face impossible odds, when logic tells you to give up, remember that sometimes the right choice isn't the logical one. On Prime, the monument in the central plaza had become a pilgrimage site. Would bring their children there, teaching them about the humans who had refused to let them die, about the sacrifice, about the stubbornness and compassion that had saved a species. And when new crises emerged in the galaxy, when other species faced disasters and impossible odds, the call went out to humanity first. Not because humans were stronger or smarter than other species, not because they had better technology or superior weapons, but because humans had proven something that day when they crossed the quarantine barrier. They had proven that some things were more important than safety, more important than logic, more important than survival itself. They had proven that compassion mattered, that every life had value, that no one should be abandoned, no matter what the odds said. The galaxy had learned a lesson, carved into history by human blood and sacrifice. When the math says impossible, when logic says abandon them, when every calculation says let them die, that's when you need humans. That's when you need someone stubborn enough, foolish enough, compassionate enough to say no. To say we're not leaving. To say we refuse to abandon them. And then to prove it, no matter the cost. Because in the end, the galaxy might run on logic and mathematics and careful risk assessment. But humanity ran on something else entirely. Something that couldn't be calculated or measured. Something that made them cross quarantine barriers and volunteer for deadly infections and sacrifice themselves for strangers. They ran on hope, on compassion, on the fundamental belief that every life mattered, that no one deserved to die alone, that the right thing to do was worth any price. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The galaxy had humanity had refused to abandon them. And the galaxy would never be the same.